All right, Liz, if I get anything really wrong, please correct me.
Wait, but I don't know anything.
But if it just sounds wrong, you can see what I'm reading.
Okay.
Hola!
I think that's wrong.
Olé! Subres Belden. Benvindo ao TrueAnon podcast. E prazer estar com vocês aqui hoje. Tão feliz por ter você conosco aqui hoje. Hoje? Oh, this is a rough one. Nós ouvimos suas ligações e nós aceitamos tirar a camisa e vamos para o Brasil.
I hope we didn't just alienate all of our Portuguese listeners.
Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Come in. Jeffrey Epstein.
Insert audio now.
We did forget to put these in the actual episode, and so we are putting it superimposed at the beginning.
You know what's funny is that we've got Crack Shop producer here. Fantastico manager of our editing staff.
40 strong.
And we could just insert this in. Listeners, none the wiser. But you know what? Our commitment to transparency here, we choose not to do so. We just keep our big old mouths blabbing on.
Would you like to hear some tour dates?
Brace. I would.
The 2nd of February of this year in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we are playing at... What?
Nothing.
We are playing at the Sinclair Ballroom. I think it's actually just called the Sinclair. That is the 2nd of February. Please come. There's tickets still available. Not so for the next night at the Sinclair, which is sold out. Then on the 4th of February, that's of course in Canadian terms, 2023, we are playing Montreal, Quebec.
Oh, you mean 0402 2023?
Oh, yeah, because they do it that funky little way.
They
do.
do.
It's going to be...
The time?
Texas. We are doing
1800.
The Theater Fairmount. That is still tickets on sale. The next night, Toronto, the Legendary Horseshoe Tavern. Hopefully it's not a legendary show because you cannot go. It is sold out. Later in the month on 2-16-2023 in Denver, capital C, capital O. We are playing at the Bluebird Theater. Tweet. The next day in Minneapolis, Minnesota, we are playing at the Fine Line, named after a thin line of cocaine. The next day...
And, for fans of the pod, Beanpole Women.
Mm-hmm. Well, they don't know about that yet because the episode hasn't started.
Spoiler alert.
Yes, but we are talking about Brazil. The next day... On February 18th of 2023, let's hope for no flight delays here, folks, because that could seriously put a kink in our plans. We are playing at the Far Out Loud.
Oh, far out, man.
In
Keep Austin weird.
Whoa, we're at the Gigafactory. We are playing at the Keep Austin Weird Far Out Lounge in Austin, Weird, Texas.
Tejas.
Yes, bringing me back to Austin at last.
And now, with that, back to the show.
Hola, Liz. How you doing?
Hi, Brace.
How you saying hola?
Brache.
Brache. How you saying hola in Portuguese? Hola.
Hola.
Hola. It's hola?
Mm-hmm.
So I got that right.
Yeah.
Even though I asked you guys if I got that right. And you guys were
I'm
like,
sorry.
no.
I was just making a joke.
No, it's cool. All good.
I think you did a great job.
Aquí. Feliciamos. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Liz.
My name is brace. And of course, we have with us today our producer, Young Chomsky, and the podcast is called TrueAnon.
I like when you do the like now.
So this has actually been a long running sort of goof between us because I always the Portuguese no in Portuguese is like N-A with a little squiggle O.
Yeah,
And in
no.
my head, which is you guys know I'm neuroatypical. I read that as now.
Neuroatypical.
Neuroatypical. We are in Brazil.
I wish it would be summer.
It would be, I guess.
Yes. It's summer down there.
Yeah, it's not summer up here.
No.
We are in Brazil, and we're actually here for football.
We're camped out.
We're camped out. We're in front of the military base. We're like, where is everybody?
I love all these automatic rifles you have with
Oh
you.
my God, so strong, so big, so many patches. And we are basically here to sell new IR devices, that's infrared, to the Brazilian military.
And exciting new plastic surgery techniques.
Yeah, we're bringing the British butt lift to Brazil. Our invention.
It's like a reverse Brazilian butt lift. It's the English butt melter.
It makes your butt look like the really thin lips of like an old crone. So but moved sideways.
I always referred to something as, I think I've said this on the podcast before, as Protestant flatsy butts.
Yeah, you've said something like that.
Protestant butt, it's like real flatsies, but we should probably amend that to include Anglican.
Well, that's the Brazilian butt lift. Is we just kind of it's crazy because we're lifting your butt off of your body because we're basically taking a giant cleaver, equivalent of a giant cleaver, and just whoom, out. Your butt needs to be completely in line with your shoulder blades. One cheek per blade.
Straight.
Yeah.
One straight. Everyone loves that look.
Yeah, it's called the bean pole, and let me tell you, 2023 is going to be a great year for it.
That's on your ins and outs list.
That's in, yeah. In bean pole, out butt. Just at all. I'm not even talking about big ones. Well,
we're not in Brazil.
We're not in Brazil because it's too dangerous.
We are in the safety of our own little homes.
Where nobody can do it. Well, we're not. No, we're in a studio.
Well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Proverbially.
You've been sleeping here?
But we did see the news coming out of Brazil. January 8th. Just a couple days ago.
Yeah.
Right?
No, like 5 days ago.
Well.
Yeah, but some days ago.
I always use people get mad at me for this. I use a couple to not mean two.
Yeah, it's definitely Friday the 13th of January, and this episode will almost certainly come out on Monday.
I always think of a couple as like a handful, like a grab bag.
Okay, yeah, but at that point, it's going to be, the 16th?
I could grab 15 things
It's
in my
going to
hand.
be over a week after it happened. Brazil, January 8th, a day that will live in infamy. Liz, what happened?
On Sunday, important to note it was a Sunday, January 8th, thousands of Bolsonaristas descended upon the capital of Brazil. That's Brasilia. There had been protests there for some time and in other locations that we'll talk about throughout Brazil. But ahead of the riot, there had been kind of like a bunch of messages going through WhatsApp warning that a storm was coming. Yeah.
So a little context, and this is something that, I am not Mr. knowledgeable about Brazilian politics. I know a decent amount about them. But one thing that I do know pretty well is that WhatsApp, big in Brazil. WhatsApp is pretty much big everywhere, but WhatsApp is particularly big in Brazil for right-wing political organizing.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
And beyond political organizing, just like crazy rumor mongering.
Yes.
And so
the old chain letter lives.
It really does.
Lives in infamy.
I mean,
Brazil.
I don't know if you remember, but I think during the 2018 campaign, there was a ton of like really crazy messages going out. And one in particular, I remember was like, the PT government, if they are elected, will be teaching your first grader sex ed. And they had all of these like, pictures and stuff. It was like going like wildfire.
Yeah, there was something like PT was handing out dildos to children.
Yes, that was,
like
it was like, PT giving dildos to kids. Yeah. And like, so But it is sort of like it is a kind of cohesive not cohesive, but like a unifying thing that like a lot of people on the right and extreme right use in Brazil to sort of like spread rumors and also organize political actions.
Yeah,
So they were going crazy in the sort of lead up to January 8th.
absolutely. Brasilia is the capital. It's kind of known as in this area, Three Powers Square.
I love that name.
I know, it's nice, right? We could talk a little bit about kind of some of the symbolism behind this maybe a little later. But it's a huge plaza. It includes, a bunch of government buildings, but, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the presidential office, they're all kind of right there. And the Bolsonaristas, as they're kind of like getting bussed in, and we should say being escorted very calmly by the federal police and military, it was just like a fucking riot, mob, crazy scene. I mean, they broke everything. Windows, they broke in and stole a copy of like squared away copy of the 1988 Constitution. There was like a video of some guy pooping on a like desk. I mean, they slashed like pretty important and famous art. They destroyed like countless artifacts. I mean, it was a full desecration.
Yeah, I want to correct you really quick. I think he was pooping off of a desk. He was sort of perched on
I
a
gotta
desk.
say, I saw the video like as I was watching it unfold. I saw it like kind of go I scrolled through it and just right on past it on Twitter. I was like, I don't need to see that. Don't want to investigate. Not interested.
Yeah. I will say it was like there are tons of videos and pictures. This is the thing. People love videotaping themselves doing really illegal things. And I will say, if I'm in, let's say, the Supreme Court of Brazil, right, and I am just putting a knife through a painting.
Yeah.
I'm just standing there stabbing a painting that's on the wall, and some guy's got his phone out doing the phone video thing. I'm gonna be like, put that down, brother. But that occurred in none of these cases, and so there's like it. And I you and I were talking about this right, sort of as it was happening and afterwards. It is sort of like astounding how much they just like everything they destroy, especially in comparison to, and we'll get to this a little more later, January 6th. Like these guys really were just like, we're destroying this place.
Yeah.
Sprinklers going off, people set fires, and so like everything's flooded. Everybody's offices are destroyed. I mean, people stole weapons. People like it was just like a fully like really brutal riot.
Yeah, and like to give a little context with that, I mean, Brasilia was created after the end of the dictatorship in kind of the mid-'80s, and then with the Constitution and the new Constitution in '88, which we can talk about. And it's it's kind of weird. It's a weird place. It's odd to kind of like sequester government away from people, right? Like Brasilia was literally created. They created a new capital, and so it's like just a capital city. It's a very kind of like postmodern project, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, like there was a lot of intention in the creation of these buildings and the symbolism behind them. I mean, all of them are glass for a reason.
Yeah.
And the idea is that, everything there is transparent. There are rooms that are purposely designed to not have seating because the idea is that politicians come in and out, and it's a building that reinforces the kind of new democratic spirit that the country was fostering at the end of the military dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of utopian side of it as well that I think, I think almost everyone is of two minds of it. But to see this kind of fascist mob destroying I mean, such a profound like symbol of the country post the military dictatorship and those decades is, leaps and bounds kind of more like unsettling than I think even any of the imagery that came out of January 6th.
Well, I think there's actually a pretty distinct difference between
for sure.
in terms of exactly what you're describing here between January 8th and January 6th. I think in January 6th, you see a lot of people who, whatever their actual political sensibilities we might call, believe themselves to be like defenders of democracy or whatever, and that like the election was stolen. We need to restore like the spirit of 1776 to this country, you know? And so they're like occupying I mean, they obviously caused damage and stuff like that, but they were for all intents and purposes, or intensive purposes, who knows which one it is.
You could say both.
I can say both. You know what? You can say both.
When you got a mic in front of you, you can say whatever you want. That's
It's
what I
true.
always
And
say.
you can pronounce any word however you'd like.
No.
They're in there like they're occupied. Like we want to take control of Congress and all this stuff. I mean, some of these people, if you actually queried them on what they want, they would probably describe essentially a dictatorship, right? But it's in the trappings of like the American democratic tradition. Whereas I think what you saw in Brazil is people actively trying to destroy these symbols of the Brazilian democratic or modern post-military dictatorship democracy, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that you see a big difference too in that a lot of the protesters in Brazil were many of them explicitly calling for the military to intervene and take control of the country, either paving the way for Bolsonaro to return or having a military dictatorship, right? And so a lot of these people, like you were saying, there's people who were camped out sort of at the Capitol, but there's also been people camped out around military bases in Brazil for months at this point. And I think a lot of people expected, it's like, now, this is a big tactic now, and it kind of was a traditional political tactic, I guess. There's always been people camping out when they want things, bonus army, all that kind of shit. But it's a pretty common political tactic is like you camp out somewhere, and you're sort of, it's like this like carnival-like permanent protest outside of somewhere. And almost all of them in Brazil were outside of military bases with people calling for a military coup. That did not occur on January 8th.
No.
Like you said, the security forces and some military police did basically doing the same thing. Same kind of shit as January 6th, like taking selfies with protesters, basically allowing people to come in, not really fighting back against them. There's some pretty arresting images, no pun intended, literally I did not mean to make a pun there, of like protesters beating the shit out of like horse cops and stuff like that.
And I mean, we should say too, obviously there were people higher up in the security forces and even in the executive that knew about this and were allowing it to happen, right?
Yeah.
Whether it was like on, the governor or the people in charge of security in the state or, and all of that is going to like get rooted out. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear that they had a lot of sympathizers,
100%.
Majority of sympathizers in the military.
Yeah. And like that I think has been pretty well noticed that like the police and military are like from top brass to rank and file men are pretty fucking pro Bolsonaro.
Yeah. I mean, they basically were his big support. I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. The military in Brazil, like socially and culturally and politically, is like it's sort of like a very interesting institution. They don't hold the kind of sway that, like, they're very important, right? And the federal police obviously are very important and they're very dangerous, but they're not like an internationally recognized force. You know what I'm saying? Like they're not like the American troops, like the Brazilian troops don't get sent anywhere. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, Haiti.
Right. But you know what I mean? Like they're not like a big international force.
No.
They are domestically, they hold a very interesting kind of like social social significance. I mean, I think still there are pretty significant like social benefits that military members are allowed that other members of society aren't. There's like a very clear like sort of like caste like beneficiary system there.
100%. Yeah.
But even just like more structurally, I mean, yes, I think Brazil has had two military dictatorships in their history, right? There was one kind of before and during World War II, and then obviously the one after the 64 coup that lasted through the 80s. But even before that, like Brazil Brazilian Republic was declared by the military.
Yeah.
Right? Like they have never had a like bourgeois revolution, which is very different from a lot of other Latin American countries. And in this sense, like they went from literally like a slave society straight into a quote unquote like republic.
Yeah.
Without any kind of social revolution. And so the kind of contradiction there, the social contradiction there, can explain or helps us to kind of understand how some of these sort of like confusing impulses can be there and why the military holds like such a, unique place in like, the public and the middle class and the lower classes.
Yeah. I mean, and
psyches.
Bolsonaro, obviously a military man himself, and somebody who, when he came to power, definitely tried to juxtapose like the military's like discipline and incorruptibility and all this stuff against what was popularly seen, at least portrayed by the media, as like the PT's lawlessness and graft and corruption, right? And so when he gets into power, he appoints military men to a lot of different pretty high up posts. I think his entire inner cabinet at one point was former or I don't know how that really works, but generals, essentially. He gave a lot of sinecures. Is that how you pronounce that? Sinecures to military men. In fact, that like there was a lot of people in the military who were basically doing double duty as civil servants and active duty military at the same time. And contrary to like wage caps and all that stuff for public servants, were basically allowed to take salaries from both, which is essentially a bribe.
Yeah.
I think it was during 2021, like the budget, I think he insisted that the military was basically the only people who got wage hikes and stuff like that. Like he was very much like a military man through and through.
Yeah, I think he was really courting their favor as well.
The problem is he did sort of blow a good amount of support, I think, from some of the upper echelon people during COVID, because this has been, so many things have happened since then, but like famously, like Bolsonaro went pretty wild. He was like DeSantis style COVID, like I'm forging my own path kind of shit. And he fired a bunch of people because they wouldn't follow his orders, which were not always necessarily maybe the most sensible during sort of the COVID crisis in Brazil. He fired his defense minister, I believe. He actually tasked the military with production of it's been so long since I pronounced this, but hydroxychloroquine, which is, I didn't know that he actually had them making it, but I read that in a couple places last night. But after he fired the defense minister, the commanders of the Army, Navy, and Air Force all resigned the next day. And, this is 2021. I think it was in March 2021. And so really not that long ago. And so he had been pretty well supported by the military, but I think that definitely did some damage. I mean, there was some pretty chaotic times in Brazil in 2021 in terms of like, we didn't really, like Bolsonaro's popularity was really, really low. COVID was raging out of control in a lot of places, and there was basically nothing being done. And I think there was sort of like, there was I think probably pretty fanciful talk of like, what if the military removes him or something, but that obviously did not happen.
We should say too that like the Bolsonaro family and specifically his sons are enmeshed with the security forces in the sense that they are the heads of a gang that runs Rio.
Yeah.
And by running Rio, I mean they go into fucking favelas under the guise of looking for quote unquote drug dealers and are murdering people like left and right. I mean, just really brutal, brutal shit.
Yeah.
And they run all of that in Rio. And his sons, I think, have fled, are living in Florida. Obviously, Bolsonaro is there now in Orlando, visiting Epcot or whatever.
Yeah, Minions themed.
Yeah, he's like eating a sandwich at
Publix.
Publix? I'm not from Florida. I don't get it. Whatever. You can have your things.
You know
That's
what?
fine.
It's a Florida thing. You wouldn't understand.
Yeah. oh my God, I hate this fucking family so much.
Yeah, that's the thing that like
It's like the fucking criminals.
yeah, that's the thing that's like they really are, and it cannot be stressed enough, literally gang leaders and criminals.
Yes.
Right? Like doing the like and not like oh, they're like it's not like Trump style like crime like in the ledgers and like, leaning on people and stuff like this. It's like fully like there's
they
a
shot
guy,
a congresswoman.
They shot a fucking they killed a congresswoman. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. And it's like and act with total impunity enmeshed in the security forces. I mean, Brazil in many ways, like many countries, is a mafia state, right? And they are part of the
there's
mafia.
a lot of rumors about
And so I think that really has to be kept in mind here is that like these are real deal like actual gangster criminals.
we were talking about this before we started recording, but there was this big story that broke, I think yesterday, about it's not. I don't know if it's like the presidential credit card. I don't want to say that that's what it is, but it's like a presidential personal account, right?
Yeah.
And Bolsonaro, he passed this law almost immediately after he took office that the records of payment account, like the records of the account, would be under seal for 40 years, so no one could see what he was spending on. And Lula gets in office, and he, immediately overturns that, and so everyone's kind of going through it, and they found just like thousands and thousands and thousands of reais like spent at bakeries where like the average thing costs, it's like it's a fucking bakery. You're getting like papaya juice and fried bread, which is delicious, by the way. But obviously, I think it's pretty clear that those are like payments to gangs.
Yeah. And like, a little TrueAnon tip here. You're the president of Brazil, right? Classic job. Fresh out of college. Don't use the presidential credit card to pay off gangs or to make very high suspicious payments to places that might not otherwise receive it. So I think like, what we were talking about this before we started recording, but like what a lot of the protesters wanted was a military coup, right? And people are calling this a coup. And maybe I'm rushing ahead here a little bit. But people are sort of calling this a coup. And I would say, in my opinion, and I know this is splitting hairs, but there's a reason we're splitting hairs here. I would say this was a riot, a pretty devastating riot, which, by the way, similar to January 6th, all of the like Brazilian right-wing fascist people are saying that it was Antifa who infiltrated. And because there's a guy with a PT flag.
There's this crazy woman. I was looking at her Twitter account last night, who's like one of the big kind of Bolsonaristas, who I think has been arrested. And she was like proudly being arrested by the military, on January 8th or whatever. And they have since, now there's all these rumors, they're trying to say that she's like left-wing. She's like a psycho right-wing fascist woman. A lot of female Bolsonaristas, by the way, which is very interesting. But now they're like trying to paint her
She's
specific.
Antifa,
They're like, oh yeah,
yeah.
she's a left-wing infiltrator.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So just deep cover.
Yeah, totally.
And well, I will say like, and again, now I'm backtracking here, but like there was some pretty crazy violence right after the election when, remember, all those people blocked off like huge swaths of like interstates and freeways in Brazil.
The military had the military had stepped in and was stopping traffic so people couldn't vote.
Yeah.
And they had to get a Supreme Court order and to kind of like come down and clear them and all of this stuff that Lula I think had to sue for. I mean, it was like a whole thing.
It was a crazy thing. And Bolsonaro also did try to really integrate the military into the voting process.
Yeah.
Because it's a digital, they use a digital system there. In fact, that they're the only country in the world that uses that particular system where there are no paper records.
Which, by the way, this goes against, I don't know, this is not on the TrueAnon rules list, but we got to add it. Paper ballots, hand counted in public. The only thing that works. That works. And the U.S. doesn't have that.
That's an example of get it in motherfucking writing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. I like that. That's the underneath.
Get it in fucking writing right there.
Including your vote.
Brazil does have a electronic only voting system. Bolsonaro has long been an opponent of it, although I guess at first he was a proponent of it, but things happen. It's been a long time. And has always sort of made these gestures towards, like pretty actually substantial gestures towards there being a lot of ways to change votes, basically rigged elections. And so in the lead up to this election, and again, I hate to be this kind of guy, similar to how Trump was doing in the U.S., Bolsonaro was really like doing his best to cast aspersions on the Brazilian voting system prior to the election. I think because, well, it's pretty obvious the polling was not very good. Even though he actually did much better than the polling would have suggested, the polling was really bad for Bolsonaro prior to the election. So he was not only being like the system is prone to fraud and corruption, but he was also like, we need the military to run a parallel count. And he was really trying to integrate the military into the electoral system to begin with. And so what he ended up doing was actually just, I guess, having the military prevent a lot of PT areas from voting in the first place. I assume, Eduardo Bolsonaro, one of his freak sons, pretty close to Bannon, et cetera. And it does seem like they were being advised. I think it was Jason Miller, too, was like going down to Brazil and all that shit. I think he got arrested there.
Freaks.
I assume it's part of this like general strategy. But yeah, that leads us essentially to like, was this a coup? Was this not a coup? Like I said, I think it's a riot by people who really wanted a military coup. But like people who, it was basically just, I don't know. I guess that's just kind of how I think about it. It's just like, the military is the decisive factor there. 2,000 or 3,000 or whatever insane raving Bolsonaristas are not capable of taking control of the political and military apparatus of Brazil. They were beseeching somebody else to do it. And when the military really did show up in force, they were being cheered by the Bolsonaristas.
Yeah.
And this was pretty edifying to watch, actually. And I hate to say it, but it's hard not to take a little bit of joy in it.
Sure.
These military men are sort of marching through. They're being cheered by the Bolsonaristas. And then they turn around and arrest everybody. Right. About 1,500 people, I think.
Yeah, as of now. And I think more arrests are coming. It's interesting. I think that there has been a rush. I saw a bit in the Western press and also in the Brazilian press and in Brazilian left press, which is interesting, to really call this a coup or an attempted coup. And I think it's interesting because, there's sort of this like, we were talking about this. There's these sort of like mirror events, right? And so you have, in my opinion, you have this event that happened in Brasilia, where you have this fascist mob, rushing these like government buildings, like we said, the Supreme Court, the Congress, the presidential office, and everyone's calling it a coup, and it looks kind of like it looks like a putsch, right? The photos of this like crazy mob swarm, and it kind of brings up these images of what you would read about as a coup in a history book, calling for the military. It's Latin America, it's kind of hitting all of these movie moments.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it wasn't a coup, and it didn't happen. And also there was no plan really to take power, right? And then you think back and you say, okay, well, but in Brazil in 2016, there was a coup. Mm-hmm. And there was a coup in those same buildings in Brasilia, in the Supreme Court, in the Senate, in the Congress, when Dilma was impeached and Lula was imprisoned, and everyone at the time said, this is not a coup.
Yeah.
This is not a coup.
This is not a coup. No. This
and
is
it
justice.
Was.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of like thinking back on these, like, so you have these like two big events in the same fucking place, not that far apart, right? Mm-hmm. And my worry is that, I worry that the kind of rush to call this a coup and say all of these things, it runs the risk of kind of obscuring or erasing a little bit that history. And I think some of that too is like a lot of people very excited Lula coming back. I mean, obviously, understandably, right?
Yeah.
Especially in Brazil. But that shouldn't, in some ways, act as a kind of like, oh, now we can kind of forget what happened and how these things, how coups actually look. And it looks like the media telling you it's not a coup and cheering it on. It looks like the middle class cheering it on. It looks like all of the pillars of international institutions and powerful institutions, saying this is the correct process and ushering it in.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened in 2016.
So I think we need to go back in time a little bit and lead up to maybe what actually did happen in 2016, because I am in full agreement with you that like it is a coup. And like there have actually been kind of a lot of coups. And I got to be honest with you, if we're counting Lula as a failed coup now that he's president again, I would say it's a successful coup that backfired in the end, actually.
Which one?
The 2016 coup against Lula, because now he's back.
I don't know if it backfired. Well, yeah, we can talk about that.
I guess that, I see what you're saying there, and I don't necessarily disagree, but like in terms of like that government, well, it's not the same government actually, so yeah, maybe not. But coups in South America haven't been doing very good lately.
Yeah, well, maybe not in the case of Peru.
Well, yeah.
Very complicated.
Very complicated situation there. But
yeah, of course, the Venezuela, many have tried.
Few have
Many have
succeeded.
failed.
Look, I'm hitting my computer out of pure, I love the guy. And in Bolivia, it was reversed,
Yes.
although we did not get Evo back. In Peru, it's just it's
a fucking disaster.
may the least popular man win.
Mm-hmm.
It's a race for whoever's the least popular to now take power. And anyways, we'll get there. Let's go back in time, 2010, Brazil. What's going on?
So 2010, Lula leaves office. We should say Brazilian presidents, they're allowed 2 successive terms. But then they're not barred from running for re-election again, but they can only, they have to wait, basically.
They didn't learn their lesson of the tyrant FDR.
Yes. So Lula had served 2, and he was a super popular guy. I mean, when he left office, he had approvals of like 80 to 87%, depending on what polling you're looking at. I mean, great margin of error there. He hand chose a successor for the PT, Dilma Rousseff, who she had never run for office. She had never held any office before. She was kind of a bureaucrat. In her youth, though, she was part of the resistance against the military. She was tortured by the military during the dictatorship in the 60s. In general, I mean, she's like a very like soft-spoken woman.
Yeah. Very
just like, she's a gentlewoman lady. I hate saying that, but she's not like a cutthroat politico.
Yeah.
She's a bureaucrat.
And to be clear about, I always say to be clear. Why is that like a brace phrase? But I'm about to be clear.
Sometimes I say that to be clear, and then I'm just more confusing.
Yeah, why am I prefacing a clear statement? Now I've just made it all confusing by digressing about, regardless. Brazilian politics are cutthroat, literally.
Yeah.
But basically, I mean, the Senate and Congress in Brazil are essentially, like, I would say 80% just like criminals. Like literal criminals, not like all politicians are crooks, but like literally just like some of the biggest criminals in Brazil, right?
Yeah.
And with that, some pretty cutthroat political arrangements too.
It's also, we don't have time and we're not going to get into the, I think, as described, serpentine nature of Brazilian party politics. But because of this is like Perry Anderson's work, right? But like because of the kind of bizarre parliamentary presidential system that they have, and the way that leads to these coalition politics, it's totally insane. Like I asked the other day, like, wait, how many parties are there in Congress right now? And it was like, I don't know, fucking 80, 90,
Yeah.
200. No,
It's-
you can just like, yeah, it's like totally
And
psychotic.
people switch parties all the time, which
Yes.
I think that should be illegal. But like, it was like when I was in the Philippines, and I was like, how many political parties are registered? They're like, oh, 500.
Yeah,
And I was like,
totally.
oh, and they're like, but they don't mean anything. It's just
Yeah.
like they don't have any politics or anything behind most of them. And I think that's sort of similar in some respects to many of the like congressional and senatorial parties in Brazil. Obviously, there are big parties with ideological lines, but it's looser in a lot of ways than like you might expect.
But not Lula, right? Member of the PT. He had governed for 2 terms, and he and also the PT at this time were pretty popular. And Dilma was pretty popular for like first 2 years, let's say. Most of this was because, I mean, during the Lula years, there was basically a huge commodity boom, which led to really great years for the Brazilian middle class.
Yeah.
You
Famously so.
Yeah, you got this like kind of crazy boom of commodity prices, and then that leads to a huge consumption boom. And there was all this Chinese investment, so they had exports rising. You had more raw materials and more development, which leads to more greater social spending. All of this. PT had a pretty famous program as well called the Bolsa Familia program, which was basically cash transfers to the poor.
Yeah.
And so during this time, they were able to raise both the minimum wage and alleviate some of the like deep, deep entrenched poverty,
Yeah.
So you had, basically thanks to all of these changes in the economy and unfortunately, but fortunately for some people, I mean, huge injections of credit, right? But poor people got a little less poor. And lower middle class people got, more middle class.
Yeah.
Which are good things. But it comes with a social price, right? Which is not a lot of middle class people were happy now that they were having to share social resources with poor people. I mean, and specifically, of course, in the case of Brazil, poor Black people.
Yeah, because that should be sort of kept in mind here too. Is that like there's a pretty extreme racism
Absolutely.
in Brazil?
Yeah, and it looks very different than it does in America, but it is very, very prominent. I think that in part explains a lot of the widespread hatred for Lula that we'll talk about amongst the middle class.
Yeah.
And there were, there's like reports of those times of all of these people complaining like, I can't believe, we're in the airport now. It's like being at a bus stop because poor people would take buses across the country. But then during the Lula years, they started,
Being able to fly.
being able to fly. And, classic kind of middle class grievances in those ways, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a kind of like succinct but not nuanced way to put this would be that at one point the PT was the party of the middle class, and after Lula left, it was the party of the poor.
Yeah.
So you had kind of when Dilma took office, on the one hand, like a lot of this social unease percolating amongst the middle class, and on the other, this like commodity boom that was fueling a kind of huge historically social spending package. I mean, they were classically broadening, university spends. There was big government works projects. There was all these cash transfers to the poor, and cheap credit kind of driving all of this.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Setting the stage. So what happens next? So it's 2008.
Liz is one of Liz's favorite years.
Classic Liz year.
Liz's 9/11 would be 2008. It's kind of like your January 6th.
My 63 even.
Yeah.
Huge unprecedented financial crisis. You know where I'm going this. But guess what?
No, you don't.
It doesn't really hit Brazil in the same way that you think, or that I think maybe some people thought I was going to say.
Exactly, because Brazilians all live in favelas, and so they did not have mortgages.
Actually, well, it has to do with the southern hemisphere. You see, it's sort of like
It's hotter out there. Everything's
goes
reversed.
Everything's reverse, including the financial crisis. No. So Lula, when he was in power, right? I think a really good description of Lula is shrewd. He's very smart. politically.
Yeah.
Very calculating, very like deal making, behind the scenes, making things happen.
I'm going to be honest with you here. I think the most important quality in a successful politician is shrewd.
Yes.
And when I was younger, I like to think of myself as shrewd.
We're not as shrewd as we should be.
I'm probably one of the least shrewd people on earth.
No one is ever as shrewd as they should be.
No, because shrewd involves a lot of people. I think Lula's height has to do with why he's so shrewd. He's a sort of a shorter guy, and I think
Yeah, you
it's
don't see
easier
him
for
coming.
shorter people to be shrewd.
Interesting.
Yeah. Excuse me. But I'm, of course, 5'2".
That means that you have a lot more potential to shrew up.
I can shrew up.
Yeah.
Oh, of course, the root word.
But, you know, I mean, Lula's ability to kind of like wield and deal power, I mean, some of that has to do with how he himself kind of came into power, how he's able to build political coalitions.
Exactly.
And the nature of the parliamentary system, kind of like as we were talking about.
Well, Lula was a big-time union organizer, right? And that gives you... There's a reason that you see a lot of union people who become... Well, I guess in the case of Pedro Castillo, that's kind of... That theory's out. But like... Evo Morales and stuff. Like in Latin America, I think being a union organizer, specifically there, it seems like it does actually give you a pretty good like ability to sort of like bypass the traditional political routes that a lot of people took, where they kind of learn those abilities on the job, being like the mayor or the governor. Or something
Absolutely.
like
And I think also even beyond skill level, I mean, it teaches you how like institutional power works and like,
Yeah.
you know, being in organs of that hold power in their own right, you know, as opposed to being outside of that.
Also, you're making lots of deals.
You're wheeling and dealing.
You're wheeling and dealing.
You're Donnie Deals, but very different South American.
Yeah.
Dilma, it looked like, would be very similar to Lula. At first, she took office in 2011, and she, 2011, global investment is starting to dry up because of the financial crisis, right? And so it looks like she's going to give these kind of, throw a bone to finance and, starts tightening monetary policy a little bit. But as things got kind of worse globally, the Dilma administration took like a totally different turn and introduced like this huge stimulus package, which included cutting payroll taxes, electricity costs. There was like, she was imposing capital controls. It was very popular, but not amongst the bourgeois front. And we should say that, finance in Brazil, we can talk about this a little bit later, but is very, very strong and structurally holds like a very important role in Brazilian politics. In 2013, so she's still in office, the central bank like undercuts this by raising interest rates. That causes costs to rise. That includes higher bus fares. That triggers a pretty famous wave of mass protests. I think we all remember in 2013.
And I think, well, let's speak for yourself. I think you can remember. I was a little busy back then, but
you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I do know. I do know what you're talking about because I read about them later. But if memory serves, a lot of the original protests were from people on the left.
Yes.
Right? And which is, protesting higher bus fares has long been something that I hate bus fares. I think buses should be free. That's why I pay the goddamn taxes for, right? But they definitely became sort of these more generalized anti-PT protests.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I mean, at first, it's funny because, it was, bus fares, it was a huge mobilization of students as well because of cuts to the universities. But it's the media, which again is also very, very concentrated in very few hands and extremely powerful in Brazil. They were cheering on at first the police attacking the protesters. And then when they were able to kind of repackage it all, as we'll see, as a kind of like generalized middle-class anger toward Dilma and the PT for how poor things were kind of going in Brazil at this time, the media starts really cheering on and supporting the protesters.
Yeah.
The political response to all of this was like really, really bad. I think there was like, Dilma thought in a gesture to kind of like win over the suddenly kind of out of control press that the administration was getting, and all this middle class resentment that if they cut social spending further, they would lay off their back. It didn't happen, and that just made the economy worse, obviously. But it's crazy because in the middle of all of this going on, Dilma miraculously gets reelected. And it was a very close election.
I do remember that.
You know, I think there's some questions of why she ran for reelection, and perhaps Lula should have been the one running and not her.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I mean, it was close. It wasn't close like Nixon-Kennedy close to give a, you know, it wasn't that close, but it was still pretty close. And I think it's safe to say that the upper middle class and finance, the media, they were not prepared to lose that election. And they were like fucking pissed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we said there was a coup, right? So we should get to the coup part, huh? Andre Singer, who's a Brazilian, I don't know, political theorist.
Singer.
No. He called Dilma's like economic package, the huge stimulus package, he called it poking the jaguar with short sticks. Which I
you
thought
definitely
was, like,
want to.
really good.
Here's my thing.
description.
This is maybe I am.
First of all,
sure.
also I love that it's like South America, so of course you're going to talk about the jaguar.
I'm blowing
It's not
that
the bear,
jaguar's
it's the
head
jaguar.
off with a fucking M60. I'm not poking it with a stick. Are you crazy? It's gonna bite you.
Not even a short, yeah, especially not a short stick.
Do you know how close my hand is to that thing's mouth?
But that's how I think it's so good because that's how he described like how politically damaging this package was, because basically poking the finance bear and poking the bourgeois bear, or jaguar, I guess, with short sticks. And they just had no response. I mean, she tried, like we say, to calm them. She fires her economic minister, who was responsible for that package, and immediately puts in a Chicago-trained asset manager from Brazil's second largest bank. I mentioned that Brazilian finance is a really strong force in the country, and it is. The two largest private banks are more than twice as large as like the huge extraction firms, which get a lot of attention. But Brazil is also home to the sixth largest pension fund in the world, and it's the largest it has the largest investment bank in South America. I mean, finance is. It's hard to overstate how powerful the banks are in Brazil.
My phone just. Do you saw that? I didn't do a fucking thing.
I
That
think
phone
it
just.
was. I think it was a ghost.
Not to mention cattlemen.
Yes.
I will say cattle ranchers are a big political force in Brazil too, just like my home state of Texas.
It's interesting, right? Because all of the growth under Lula had been basically fine for industrialists, right? Because, social positions improve and then so does consumption, which spurs investment and so on and so forth. Classic. But when all that growth died under Dilma, the Dilma government, they basically tried to woo the manufacturers and those kind of, and even the ranchers and that kind of side of things and producers to their side. But it didn't last very long, the support. And I think this is a kind of sometimes often missed point about financialized countries. And Brazil is, of course, famously highly financialized. I mean, that was part of the sort of deal of the democratization, right? I mean, it was like a huge, the neoliberalization of Brazil is, well documented. But I always think of financialization as a kind of, I think it's like, I don't know which Spider-Man movie it's in, but
Wait.
I think it might be the one where there's the bad Spider-Man.
I'm going to be honest with you, Liz. I've never seen a Spider-Man movie.
Okay, but there's this like black ooze.
Okay.
Or is that Deadpool or is it Spider-Man?
No, that's Venom.
Venom. Okay,
Yeah.
Venom, yeah.
I loved
often-
Venom as a child, but comic
Really?
book Venom, yeah.
That's cute.
I thought he was really cool. There was Venom and who's the other guy? Crimson? No. There was a red Venom.
Spider-Man.
People will know. No, it's. You'd think it was Carnage. There was Carnage.
Carnage?
And I had a comic book that was Venom and Carnage when I was a little kid. I loved comic books as a little kid. I was
the word symbiote.
Symbiote.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's how I learned the word venom. Probably, to be honest
And
with you
Carnage.
guys, and Spider-Man.
Yeah.
But it's weird because I liked Venom and Carnage, but I thought Spider-Man was. I didn't like him.
Yeah.
I
Well,
couldn't figure out how the web thing worked.
No one can.
I'm like, is it out of his hand?
Yeah.
He made it, so he's just a genius.
Seems like a mess.
Talk about shot web.
yeah.
Anyway, I often think of financialization. I always imagine that venom thing where it's like kind of like oozing and seeping, and then it just kind of like covers everything and then remakes it in its image.
Fern Gully.
Similar, yes. But so we throw around that term a lot, and financialization means a lot of things. Yes, okay. But one of those things is that it structurally expands finance influence through the creation of kind of cross-class coalitions of basically rentier capitalists. So people who would have not been before but are now through investments earning interests, they are suddenly now in a cross-coalition with financiers who are earning high salaries and commissions based on investments, right?
Okay.
And so it creates this new sort of cross and much stronger coalition, cross-class coalition that really wasn't there before without that kind of new methodology of extraction. In addition to all of this, manufacturers as well are very like vocal and they're just socially part of like an upper middle class society
Yeah.
in Brazil, right? And so suddenly you have in this like moment of from Lula to Dilma, this very highly organized and common class interests between upper middle class society, bankers, manufacturers, and middle class professionals. And all of them are fucking ready to pounce on the PT.
Also, that's the classic fascist coalition.
Absolutely. So in response to all of everything that's going on, the central bank raised interest rates so high that they hit 14.25%.
Okay.
Which is very high even for Brazil. I mean, the country goes into deep recession, falling investment, unemployment, wages are declining. It's a fucking disaster. And the meltdown of Dilma's government basically happened overnight. There's a really heartbreaking quote from Lula where he says, I think looking back on this, he says, we won the election one day and the next day we lost it. And part of this is because PT didn't have a coalition to support them, right?
Yeah, and I think that like that's an important structure because listen, I'm learning a lot here too, right? Like you know a lot more about Brazilian politics than I do, but I do know how politics works in general,
Yes.
right? And you gotta have your guys,
That's a classic TrueAnon rule.
That is a TrueAnon rule, but that's just a rule. Like you gotta have your fucking guys.
Yeah.
And like more importantly, if you are, and this actually is true for extreme right-wing organizations too. Hopefully none of them are listening. But you gotta have your organizations too, right? You gotta have your little organs of power throughout the country. You really kind of want an armed one too.
Yeah.
But you can't really. What are you gonna do? They're a social democratic party. But Lula, I do know, did not have that.
Yeah, and
The PT, I do know, did not have that.
yeah, or Lulismo, if we want. Like that coalition of support wasn't really anywhere to be found. And it's important to kind of explain why. I mean, the poor were beneficiaries of the PT for sure.
100%, yeah.
But it was in a passive way, right? I mean, cash transfers are not, and this is a classic kind of criticism of the PT, but cash transfers aren't a replacement for education and organizing people into a kind of political, like solid class form, right?
I mean, that's part of the limitations of social democracy, and I would say purposeful limitations of social democracy and the social democratic movement too, is that like it really, the best you're going to get out of them is these kind of cash transfers to the poor. I mean, and education and stuff like that too. But like there is sort of a structural incentive in a lot of ways not to build working class organs of power that look out for their own interests as a class, because that might lead to some breaks with the social democratic movement, which is kind of what happened in the first place. And so, yeah, I think that like, you kind of seen this. I mean, it's complicated because you also, like Venezuela, I mean, you could also make the argument there that like it's a social democratic government there as well, right? I guess, a more left social democratic government, but still, I think in many ways a social democratic, not a communist government. And I think that's really what you run up into in all of 20th and 21st century social democracy is that like you get to like not even the edge, but you get to like, within spitting range of the edge. And you're like, well, we're going to stop here. Right. And obviously, like, listen, if you want to make gains, my advice is don't let your gains be reversed. And a good way to
You
make
could never let your gains be
you
reversed.
really don't want to let your gains be reversed. And like, that's just sort of the tragedy of the social democracy in general, right? Is that like,
Yeah.
yes, there can be these great gains for the poor and the working class, or great, I'll say gains, right? Like, but there's no actual like in general sense, like not a lot of actual like political movement forward there.
Yeah. And I mean, this is like a big criticism of the PT of that time. I mean, it's like you're drenching people, lower middle class, not even just the poor, right? In cheap cars and movie theaters and malls and just cheap consumption. And it wasn't even with the cash transfers from like, single mothers and stuff. It wasn't organizing anyone into a political force. Like what
Absolutely
we're
not.
talking about.
Like exactly. So like, I'm being honest with you. Instead of like a movie theater or whatever, a credit card, these people should have been given rifles and a commander. I'm not kidding.
But additionally, I mean, even when you look at the ways in which the poor benefited under Lula, like they weren't even structured to create political solidarity.
Yeah.
And now some of that is due to the just like political and like the realities of Brazilian governance. Like, I mean, there wasn't any kind of really redistribution of wealth or a changing of the tax structure. That would take an incredible amount of political leverage that probably just wasn't there.
Yeah.
Brazil has an incredibly regressive tax structure, which leads itself to obviously an incredibly regressive class structure. All of that kind of coming from the quote unquote democratization years. So distribution could only take a highly individualized form, right?
Yeah.
It's that's all it could take. And wage increases is good. It means more people have jobs and labor is expanded. But if there's no organizing, like we're saying, then there's no organizing into unionization. And that didn't happen under PT. So when cheap credit, it means private consumption rises, but it's at the expense of investment into public services. You saw the deterioration of schools, of the health system. I mean, all of that stuff happened under PT as well, right? Yeah. And those public services are shared by a middle class that is now not just resenting that they're sharing it with the poor, but they're seeing also the quality decrease.
Yeah.
So all of this is like that we're kind of laying out, because I promise we get to the cuckoo part. Is
the cuckoo part?
Yeah. Like a coup happens in a political vacuum, right?
Yeah.
When highly organized and acute class interests can take advantage of a collapsing political status quo. And in Brazil, which I want to say this is the case for basically every country in the fucking world, that happens with the support and the recognition of the United States government. Yes.
Yeah. Which I would say has been a crucial factor in many coups that not even necessarily linked to the U.S.
Yeah.
Right.
And certainly this one in 2016.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah.
So I mentioned, earlier we were just chatting that there's been 2 military dictatorships in the history of Brazil. The one in the 30s, I think it went through like the mid-40s. I can't remember the year it ended.
I can't either.
45, maybe? Don't quote me on that, even though we're recording.
Even though a lot of
I
things...
love saying don't quote me on that while recording. I think that's funny.
I think actually a lot of governments that Liz liked ended in 1945.
And then, of course, the one that, from the mid-'60s up into the mid-'80s, the military coup d'etat in 64. We talked a little bit. Did we talk a little bit about that with Vince Bevins?
I think we've done like a couple Brazil. Dude, we've been a podcast for so long.
I feel like we didn't really talk too much about the 64 coup, but, obviously 64, the military seized power in Brazil. protecting capital from the rest of the, and, this is all, at this moment, look, I'll say Brazil in the 50s was getting probably a bit, and in the early 60s, close to some exciting, not revolutionary moments, and I wouldn't say communist, but it was moving in a progressive direction, in a left-wing direction.
Absolutely. There was land reform.
Absolutely.
Which is, my take on land reform.
Yeah.
Always push the government to do land reform and then overthrow them.
Yes. Which is a great position. Mm-hmm. The U.S. was basically an invisible partner in the coup, and was quite vocal through diplomatic cables of their support of the military in '64. We shipped ammunition, we shipped arms, we shipped like an entire naval task force to Brazil in preparation for the military intervention.
Which, by the way, is that shipping the naval always with coups. Look where the Navy is too, because you saw the same thing in Italy as well.
Yeah.
You always got the Navy, the U.S. Navy parked outside.
Yeah. The military didn't end up needing it because that's how fragile the political situation was in '64. But the U.S. was standing at the ready. They also recognized the military dictatorship immediately, almost before it even happened. It was so quick.
And the thing is, from what I understand, right? And again, I'm not Mr. Genius about this kind of stuff. I read about it, right? But I'm not
good. But
I mean, I think I'm probably better than the average guy in the street, unless he's Brazilian. But the average guy in the street, couldn't tell Brazil from Portugal, which I can. A lot of, I would say, right-wing Brazilians look favorably upon the military dictatorship because they do, there is still a huge, anti-communism is still a huge part of the right wing in Brazil, right?
Yeah.
And they do view that military dictatorship as a bulwark against communist movements that they saw as destabilizing the rest of South America and Central America during the 1960s through 1980s.
I think also in addition that kind of globbing onto and morphing with the explosion of the evangelical movement.
Yes, because Satanism and communism are inextricably, I mean, you really, there's a lot of people, and I am not exaggerating here, that would call Lula straight-faced a Satanist.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
On the Brazilian
I mean,
right.
the evangelical, oh, God, these are fucking frightening. I mean, evangelical fascists in Brazil. And their, rise and grind economy, which is all tied into, YouTube, digital stuff. I mean, it's a total, but you think Brazil, it's a Catholic country, Latin America. That is an evangelical, crazy, psycho. I mean, fucking Bolsonaro was didn't he get baptized in Israel? It's something psychotic.
I don't know, but I gotta be honest. Bolsonaro, the guy's got 50 shirts that just say Israel. He's always chilling with and there was
Did you see the Israeli flag that the
Brasilia?
Bolsonaristas were flying in Brasilia?
They love it.
Yeah, because it's evangelical. It's fucking psycho. Anyway, yeah, they're fascists.
And by the way, they're no friend to the Jews. I want to be clear here. They're no friend to the Jews. They want us all to go there, and so it's the end of the world.
Okay, back to '64. So, the U.S. immediately recognizes the dictatorship and gets immediately together a new economic plan for the country. I mean, that's, of course, the role. The coup that occurred in 2016 basically required similar support from the U.S., and we know now, thanks to very recent reporting, I think it was 2019, 2020, that all of this started coming out in The Intercept, that the U.S. was pretty much hand in hand with this coup.
Yeah.
Right? So, 2014, 2 years prior to the coup, we're not going to get into the weeds about this because it's a little complicated, but I'm going to try and do my best to kind of give a overarching summary so we can kind of, and hopefully move through it as quick as I can. But federal investigations begin into corruption dealings at Petrobras. Now, Petrobras is one of Brazil's state-owned oil company.
Yeah.
Right? It's I think it's I think it's the largest state-owned company. Okay.
Okay.
But not private, state-owned. These hearings, people may have heard, were called Operation Car Wash.
Mm-hmm.
Lava Jato?
You know exactly what to insert there, right, Jan Chomsky? Working at the car wash.
Oh my. For a year, these investigations were basically only really ostensibly focused on Petrobras. And it was, who at the company higher up were kind of giving and receiving bribes. Now, culturally, corruption as a political bugaboo,
Yeah.
it has a big place in Brazilian political history for a
Yeah.
lot of reasons that we really don't have time to get into, even though I know this is going long anyway. But so just kind of understand that. And it's a real middle class. It's like that classic middle class. We want to get corruption out.
Yeah, yes.
And there's a lot of reasons why, again, the structure of the Brazilian parliamentary and presidential system, like we were talking about, it thrives on political coalitions, which means paying a lot of people, and people kind of creating their own parties and just being electors. And then also, like I was kind of saying about with the import of bourgeois society onto a slave society, right? That the kind of this is social, the kind of bourgeois social norms that we kind of take for granted, but we don't think about, but that come with the classic bourgeois revolutions in Europe and in somewhat in America, we're not fully socially integrated and politically integrated in Brazil because they were not homegrown; they were also imported, right? So there's a lot of reasons for that. Anyway, in 2015, April 2015, the federal investigators and the presiding judge, remember this name, Sergio Moro, they basically focused their attention away from Petrobras and onto the PT.
Yes.
The treasurer of the party is the first to get brought down, and then two of the largest, two of the heads at the largest construction company, that they basically are seen as receiving bribes from PT.
Yeah.
Getting sweetheart deals, development deals. PT now is getting portrayed by an increasingly insane media as corrupt through and through. The way the media is showing Dilma, by the way, is completely psychotic and misogynist, by the way. But they're calling her, they're like, she's crazy. She's doing these weasel deals. She's a witch. She's blah, blah. It was she's the most soft-spoken woman you've ever seen in your life. It is such a complete and total, just fake reality. Yeah. And now there's starting to be protests in the street in support of Moro and punishing the PT. It's kind of difficult to overstate how big of a political scandal this was because it was being fueled so much by the media. And a lot of that was because Moro was such a fucking star.
He was an incredible smooth operator. I mean, I remember when this was going down. He's young. He's good looking. Sergio Moro sounds like a musician.
Sounds like a fake name.
Exactly.
It sounds like
Moro Wind. And he really he played the media so fucking well in this. And they were happy to play along too.
Yeah, I mean, he's feeding them targeted leaks very early on to get the media to start associating Dilma with corruption, examples of corruption at Petrobras. Beginning all the way in 2014, which by the way is illegal for a presiding judge to give media information, and he was just going on all the time, running his fucking mouth.
Take it.
And after 2 years of leaking a bunch of innuendo to the press that they ran with, they still couldn't come up with anything real that Dilma did. Mm-hmm. And what she ends up getting impeached on is quote unquote fiscal peddling, which is not an impeachable offense. And then the Senate legalized it 1 week after she was removed from office.
Fiscal peddling?
Yeah, it's total bullshit. But
what, DoorDash?
Moro didn't. What's interesting about what Moro did is that he didn't just arrest construction industry insiders that he found guilty for bribing politicians and all of that. He basically forced that company and the 5 biggest construction companies in Brazil to halt all of their projects, which caused 500,000 people to lose their jobs.
Okay, so I see where this is going, right? Mm. So you've got Dilma sort of under fire for all of these so-called shady deals or whatever that haven't been proven. Mm-hmm. It was never that. No, but she's been like harangued in the media and about a lot of like construction industry stuff too, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have at the same time construction industry basically halting, all these people losing their jobs. Public anger is going to even more focus onto Dilma and the PT.
Yes. I mean, that move that Moro did, which is also, by the way, it's hard to see that outside of any kind of like forced, like recessionary move, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's estimated, the BBC estimated that it dropped Brazil's GDP, that move alone, by 2.5%. That's how big the halting of all of those construction projects and those development projects was. And that move alone tripled the effects of the Brazilian recession.
Wow.
Which is just, I mean, it's like, to use a brace word, it's astounding.
Do I be saying that?
Yeah, it's really cute. I love when you say it. It reminds me of Draymond Green because I think he says it a lot. He says that's incredible. This is incredible.
I say incredible a lot too.
Yeah.
I will say that's not the first time been compared to Draymond. I get the Draymond thing a lot, and it's actually honestly kind of bugs me.
You are a baller. It's true. Mm-hmm. In March of 2016,
I'm tall.
You are. In March of 2016, Sergio Moro, he moves in not just on Dilma. Uh-huh. Now he's focusing on Lula. Lula, who is not in office.
Yeah.
But still remains, even outside of that, very popular. Mm-hmm. Okay?
My name, if I was born to be a girl, was going to be Lulu. So I feel
really?
I was going to be Lulu.
Wait, spelled how?
Lulu.
Oh, Lulu. Okay.
Lulu. That was going to be my name.
My friend's kid is named Lou, but Lou. That's why I asked.
Oh, well, that's a name for a guy.
Yeah, but this one, anyway. Okay, so March 2016, the federal police bring in Lula for questioning in the early hours of the morning, right in front of cameras.
Perp walk. Total perp walk.
I mean, It was psycho.
Yeah, like 100%. I mean, that's pretty common in any police force or whatever. Like there are I guess they would be informants, but there are members of basically every police force in every country in the world who have a paid relationship with the press where they're like, hey, this important person's going to come take a picture.
But
blah,
it
blah.
was such a stunt.
That's going to say this though, this came from the top.
Yes. Moro tapped Lula's phone and released to the press a call that happened from Lula to Dilma about that. Basically, he was like, you should appoint me chief of staff. Now, the thing to know about Brazil is that members of the government have immunity from prosecution while they are like still members of the government, unless it goes to the Supreme Court and they can overturn that.
Which is funny because I'd always been under the impression that is to prevent coups and that sort of thing.
It is.
Yeah.
That's what's very funny,
Doesn't
right?
really work very
That was
well.
put in place after the dictatorship.
Yeah.
Now, the press used this to basically push the story that this is PT shielding Lula from what should be a just arrest.
Yeah.
So, meanwhile, at this same time, the car wash investigators it starts spreading through the political class in Brazil that the car wash investigators now have a list of names, 200 Brazilian politicians that they have that from all different parties, because there's a billion, that are all involved in corrupt deals, and they're ready to arrest all of them or start proceedings. That freaks out basically every single member of Congress in Brazil.
Yeah.
And they are now looking at, they're basically like, who do we have to S? Whose D do we have to S to get this car wash operation to end?
Because basically, I mean, this kind of happened in Italy.
Yes, very similar.
When like everybody got arrested and was like
Yes.
linked, except for the communists, was like linked to basically like influence peddling, organized crime, corruption, all that kind of stuff. And so these guys were like, "Oh, hold on, we don't want to be Italian."
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I was about to make a joke about Brazilians and Italians, but I won't.
You won't.
A top guy at PMDB, which is one of the political parties, he's taped telling a colleague that, quote, the guys in the Supreme Court told him Okay, that's an actual. He says literally the guys in the Supreme Court told him
These guys in the Supreme Court.
that basically car wash and everything would continue unless Dilma is impeached, replaced by her vice president, Michael Temer, and then a national government is formed around him, which is backed by the Supreme Court and the army. And this guy says he's already spoken to the army and that they have his full support.
Okay.
This is a coup.
Yeah, 100% this is a coup.
And this is exactly what happened, right? So almost immediately, the House, because they're all incentivized now, they're freaked out, they're all going to get arrested or whatever. They immediately, literally the next day, vote to impeach Dilma, and then the Senate immediately finds her guilty on all the charges.
Yeah.
If you can find a video of the Senate vote and you understand Portuguese or you can find a translation, like, I highly recommend you watch this. It's really fucking disgusting to see. There's all these kind of like youngish, and some oldies, Brazilian politicians like fucking holding up Bibles and like, I mean, it's just horrifically sexist and disgusting and it's just anti-liberal. It's like so many horrible things. And this includes, of course, famously,
Bolsonaro. This I remember vividly because he gave this sort of speech before his vote.
Yeah.
Where he says they lost in 1964, the coup, and now they lost in 2016. Yeah. And he dedicates his vote to the memory of Colonel Carlos Alberto Brilhante Ustra, which I'm no doubt, well, it's a name, I can say it however I want, the dread of Dilma Rousseff. Yeah. So that is actually the military officer who oversaw the apparatus that tortured Dilma when she was imprisoned by the dictatorship. So he is literally dedicating his vote to the guy that like arrested and tortured the woman that he's impeaching. And I mean, there's I guess a lot of gender stuff that goes into this as well because Bolsonaro is well known for his, I guess, unique takes on Dilma and women in general.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of that subtext to that as well.
So remember, Brazilian presidents, right? They're limited to 2 successive terms, but basically they can run again after that, or after like a little interregnum, as people like to say. So what's important to then point out is that for this coup to be successful, there had to be a double move because it wasn't just enough to get Dilma out and put Temer in. Lula needed to be imprisoned.
Yeah.
So that he couldn't run because if you're in prison, you can't run. Unlike the U.S., actually.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, Debs.
But at the time of Lula's conviction, all polling showed him as like the overwhelming front runner to win again in 2018. With the criminal conviction, like I said, he would be ineligible to run, and that basically cleared the way for Bolsonaro. So Lula gets arrested in 2018 on corruption charges that he committed, quote, indeterminate acts. This is literally what it was called.
You don't want to be arrested for that.
With zero evidence is presented, but he was basically convicted by the media, right? Because this had all been primed and ready, and all of this sort of class resentment had been building in Brazil for so long, right? We're trying to kind of present all these different angles. Lula appeals his case, famously, of course, on habeas corpus grounds, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, to the very fucking building the Bolsonaristas trashed, right? This is in this building. The head of the Brazilian army says that granting Lula habeas corpus would threaten the stability of the country. And the Supreme Court votes 6-5, basically barring him from running.
Well, I will say, too, that a general, when Lula was arrested, had a tweet drafted by Army High Command that said, the Brazilian army believes that it shares the desire of all citizens to repudiate impunity and respect the Constitution, social peace, and democracy, as well as keeping its eye on its institutional missions. So this was coordinated, right? I mean, you have the Brazilian High Command of the army writing fucking tweets for generals about like, yes, this is the right thing to do. We need to arrest this guy. The fucking army.
Yeah, the army working hand in hand, by the way, with the organs in Congress, the Supreme Court, right? The vice president who completely, I mean, absolutely knew what was going on.
Temer? Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So in Dilma's own cabinet, in the executive, in the presidential office, again, the 3 buildings that were attacked January 8th, and then in the media and the middle class and the upper middle class and this, finance and the industrial, all these interests were coming together, right? I mean, this is a coup. But like I said, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the final boss that has to give its approval. Good old US of A.
Yeah.
And, I got to say that Brazil Wire has done a fantastic job.
Great website.
Yeah, they are great journalists there of putting together kind of a timeline here and piecing together through what they can of how involved the U.S. was in the coup.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty damning. So they have, according to a leaked State Department cable from back in 2009, this is so crazy. DOJ ran a training camp for prosecutors in Rio called Project Bridges. This is in as early as 2009. So Lula is still in power.
Yeah.
Right? Sergio Moro was the keynote speaker. He must have been in his fucking 20s at the time or something. And during the event, the U.S. and the Brazilian delegations discussed the possibility of beginning a joint corruption investigation located in Curitiba, which is, of course, where Operation Car Wash was located. Then in 2013, Ed Snowden reveals that the NSA had been spying on and listening into Petrobras and looking in on internal communications. In 2014, right, you get Operation Car Wash, and that's announced as a joint operation between the U.S. DOJ, the FBI, the SEC, and local Brazilian public prosecutors in Curitiba, along with the Brazilian Federal Police. And that's important to know. The U.S. was the FBI was a partner in this investigation. And The Intercept has done a lot of reporting through basically a tranche of leaked Telegram communications of, how much the U.S. was overstepping its legal bounds in its involvement in this investigation. So after the installation of the coup regime, the Temer, when Temer became president after the impeachment, the government immediately, one of the first things they do, in addition to all of the kind of classic neoliberal, I mean, they passed a law that they froze all social spending for 20 years.
Yeah.
Literally, there's no social spending in Brazil for 20 years
Incredible.
above the rate of inflation. I mean, it's a fucking death spiral, right? But not just that, the government immediately starts selling off Brazil offshore petroleum at market rates, below market rates, to Exxon and Chevron. And then they pass a $300 billion tax break for foreign oil companies to come into Brazil. I mean, this shit sounds like something that you read from back when you're like, oh, we used to call them banana republics.
I think too, wasn't there also at one point, didn't the U.S. create, just give the prosecutors a bunch of money too? They made a foundation and put them in charge of it.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of pay-to-play stuff happening as well.
Yeah.
In 2017, Acting Assistant Attorney General Kenneth A. Blanco, he gives a speech at the Atlantic Council, friends of the pod, where he basically bragged of how successful DOJ's quote-unquote informal involvement in the car wash operation was. And then, of course, the lead prosecutor, very famous guy, the lead prosecutor for the car wash investigations, he described Lula's 2018 arrest as literally, he says it, a gift from the CIA.
Well, that's shooting a little straight there, right? I mean, he's being honest. But yeah, I mean, that's I think what you saw in Operation Car Wash and in the removal of Dilma and Lula from political life is a full lawfare style coup.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And I think that that's a pretty important thing to keep in mind, that a coup does not necessarily look like tanks on the Grand Boulevard, A coup can oftentimes look like telegram messages or whatever and between prosecutors. And then a bunch of people. I mean, what you have here is a real deal, true no shit criminal conspiracy to get the PT out of power, and then put in, well, it turned out to be Bolsonaro.
And I mean, just, and to what end? To free social spending, to, reassert finance like structural role that like just even the gains that, yes, we have criticism of during PT, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even just poor people getting a little less poor was too much.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Like, I don't want to be misunderstood here. Like, I like it that poor people got money.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think we're just trying to describe, some of the structural contradictions and frustrations with this type of program and why it led to a collapse of the coalition.
But now,
well, Lula's back.
Lula's back.
Yeah.
Right? Lula's back, and which is, wonderful, right? I don't think he's in as strong a position as he once was.
Well, it's interesting, because I think that the question then is, well, okay, well, if you say, oh, this is a coup, then why would they let him back in?
Yeah.
And I think people kind of misunderstand how interests change and calculations changed based on historical conjunctures, right? None of this is personal. You know what I'm saying? It became when the kind of insanity of Bolsonaro, I think, became too much for the media to turn a blind eye to. Because, we were talking about this before. During the election, when Bolsonaro was running, I mean, the media, the whole line was, okay, we know he's kind of crazy. We know he says some things. But don't worry, his finance people are fantastic.
They're great, top-notch.
The people behind him, that will steward the country is fantastic. And the media was overwhelmingly pro-Bolsonaro, which is a big distinction between what happened with Trump, right?
Yeah.
When that position became completely untenable, like you're describing in this, in the years, especially with COVID, right? And how bad things were getting in Brazil. And then you had the revelations of these Telegram groups and all the reporting that was coming out, and it became completely untenable for Moro he was named justice minister under Bolsonaro, right? Like, for him to continue in that position, and it became politically unpopular, things change, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think that means that finance is structurally tamed, that it doesn't occupy that same role, that the middle class in Brazil is somewhat suddenly okay with Lula.
Yeah.
I mean, things are contingent.
I think there are some rays of hope, though. I think that, listen, you know me. You know that I actually know shit, like not doing a podcast bit here or whatever, like firmly believe that, like, once you get into power, you should arrest your political opponents in a situation like this. I'm not saying like when you become mayor of Milwaukee, although, we'll see how far it goes. I think one similarity to January 6th that January 8th has is that there are certain political figures here who did overplay their hands, right? Like it looks like this former security minister definitely fucked up. And they found that document in his house about overturning the election, which didn't Trump have some similar, lackey that had a thing like that?
I would bet that there's a lot of internal stuff that gets
hey, we might as well
printed,
draft this.
developed, and then suddenly your boys, you're like, hey, where'd everyone go?
Yeah, exactly.
Where's my support?
Yeah.
And then it falls through.
And so, who knows if Bolsonaro will be arrested? I mean, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility.
It would be crazy for the U.S. to extradite him.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if he can stay here a lot longer than 30 days anyways.
I mean,
maybe he could just be like, oh, my tummy hurts again.
Yeah, that's what he always does when he doesn't know what to do.
Yeah, I think he go to the hospital. Yeah, he's been in the this is sort of done to death, but Bolsonaro loves going to the hospital as much as I love not being in the hospital. But I do hope just that Lula does take this seriously, because I don't think that it's not like I think that there's going to be this big military coup against Lula in like a year or two or whatever. But I do think this sort of purge of the security forces, purge of the political forces, these arrests that should, literally by Brazilian law come in and be pursued. I hope that they do happen, just because that will not only probably make it safer to be a poor Brazilian, But it's these people play dirty, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because I think it's like you want Lula to come back and basically laser eyes mode, dark Lula, revenge for my imprisonment.
Tall Lula.
But on the other hand, because of the realities of the political system, he's got to govern with some pretty unsavory guys.
Yeah, he's got some. Some
right wing, classic right wing guys.
Yeah, in his coalition. Yes.
Yeah. And so it becomes a question of how do you balance those things? Now, being the shrewd politico that he is, perhaps he'll be able to find a balance. But I would not be surprised to see a lot of these ugly enemies rear their head again in the next couple years.
Yeah. Well, my name is Brace.
I'm Liz.
We're, of course, joined by producer Young Chomsky, and the podcast is called...
It's called TrueAnon. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein.